The Konig class would be the fourth German dreadnought class, the only true German second-generation dreadnoughts, and the last class of Imperial German battleships to be fully completed. Their life began in 1910, whilst the previous class, the Kaisers, were still having the final details of their own design nailed down. There was something of a budget and time constraint on the ships, and so ambitions to deal with the then under construction Orion class and their 13.5-inch guns by either upping the Germans' own gun calibre or multiplying the number of 12-inch guns by using triple turrets would both fall by the wayside. Instead, the ships would basically use the Kaiser class as their starting point, with, relatively speaking, minimal changes. The single biggest change, and the most visible, was the layout of the main battery. The Kaisers had broken with the Nassau and Helgoland class patterns of hexagonal main gun turret layouts in favour of having one forward turret, a pair of superfiring aft turrets, and two N-echelon amidships turrets for a theoretical 10-gun broadside, albeit an 8-gun broadside at the wider angles. With the Königs, one amidships turret was moved forward to a superfiring position, and the remaining one was then moved to the centre line, giving a full 10-gun broadside, on pretty much all reasonable angles. Admiral von Tirpitz had an ambition to power the class with diesel engines, but this would not come to pass. Instead, the ships would end up running with an all-turbine power plant. This would result in the construction of ships armed with 12-inch guns at a time when everyone else was moving on to 13.5-inch or 14-inch guns, and indeed the 15-inch armed Queen Elizabeths were only a year away from being laid down when the first of the Königs was laid down itself on October 1911. The class was 4 ships strong: König, Großer Kurfürst, Markgraf and Kronprinz, all laid down in late 1911, launched in the first half of 1913, except for Kronprinz, which launched in February 1914, and all entering the fleet between July and November 1914. Displacing just under 26,000 tons at normal load, the ships carried a main battery of 10 12-inch guns and 5 twin turrets, laid out as mentioned previously in superfiring pairs fore and aft with one amidships. Secondary battery firepower was provided by 14 single 150mm or 5.9-inch guns mounted in casemates, 7 per side. Mounted higher up and up front were 6 88mm casemate-mounted guns for anti-torpedo boat work, with 5 submerged torpedo tubes rounding out the as-built armament, 1 in the bow and 2 per side. In theory, there were supposed to be 4 single 88mm anti-aircraft guns installed as well, but they were only put in gradually over the course of the ship's careers during the war. Speed came courtesy of 31,000 shaft horsepower, which drove 3 screws, getting the ship up to 21 knots, using a mixture of coal and oil, although unlike many other combined fuel boilers which sprayed oil onto coal, in this case 3 of the boilers would burn only oil and the remaining 12 burnt only coal. Armour was quite thick for the period, with a maximum of 350mm or 13.8 inches on the belt, and between 16 and 100mm or 2.4 to 3.9 inches on the deck, with the thicker parts largely being the slopes of the armoured deck's turtle back, in common with most ships of this time period. Incidentally, turtleback or turtle deck armour is in fact a term used in period literature. It's not a modern invention. As the most modern battleships in the High Seas Fleet at the start of World War I, the ships were assigned to the 3rd Battle Squadron, but placed at the front of the line. Although providing cover for a number of operations by 1st Scouting Group, the High Seas Fleet, and thus the Königs, did not engage with the Royal Navy until the Battle of Jutland. Here, as the leading ships, they saw most of the action that involved German battleships that day, with the class first engaging the battlecruiser fleet, then various British destroyers, sinking 2 of them, and then 5th Battle Squadron. After a pause, there was a further engagement with various British cruisers that led to the destruction of HMS Defence, although exactly which ship in the German fleet fired the fatal shot remains unknown. In exchange, all of the ships in the class, bar Kronprinz, took varying degrees of damage. The other 3 were therefore out of action for between a month and a half and 2 months, gradually returning to service with the fleet in late July 1916. Subsequently, the ships would see further action in the Baltic, where Konig eventually drove off the annoyingly persistent Russian pre-dreadnought Slava, although not before both she and Kronprinz were forced to withdraw from an earlier engagement by the Slava. Two members of the class were also torpedoed by the submarine HMS J1 during 1917, although both survived. Subsequently, the ships saw relatively little action bar the occasional abortive sortie, and would then be sent to Scapa Flow at the end of the war with the bulk of the High Seas Fleet, all four of the class scuttling themselves on the 21st of June 1919. Grosser Kurfürst was eventually salvaged just prior to World War II, but the other three are still down there if you are a more experienced diver and you want to visit these days.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.